Now, just as we've discussed previously, generally speaking, the deeper the processing associated with any specific material, the greater the odds that this information will be encoded into long-term memory. Now, it also increases the odds that this information will be retrievable from long-term memory at some later date. And as we'll find out, this is actually the far more important aspect of depth of processing when it comes to being able to remember some items in the future. Now also please remember that the greater the degree or depth of processing increases the ability to remember regardless of a person's intention to actually learn. This was seen in the study that examined an intentional learning task where they were required to learn some items, some words, and also when they were asked to determine how pleasant those words were, and in both these cases their memory performance was identical. Well, why is it then that deeper processing leads to increased memory rates? Well, it turns out that this phenomena has not really that much to do with encoding information, as I just alluded to previously, but rather how one is able to access memories that are stored in long-term memory or storage. And the ease with which one can pull memories out of long-term memory is ultimately determined by how memories are organized in the brain itself. And some are, of course, organized better than others, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But as an analogy to think about this, the book uses an example of libraries, whether they're sorted or not, which is great. Can you imagine trying to find a textbook in a library if there was no order whatsoever to all of the books in the library? But I'm not sure how many people actually get stuff from the library anymore. So another example you could use is a department store, something like Target or Home Depot. Most things are relatively ordered. Yes, there's some haphazard nature to it, but generally toys are with toys and clothes are with clothes and home appliances are with home appliances. And it makes it relatively easy to find various things that you're looking for. But imagine instead of that kind of organization, they just dumped everything that showed up to the store in just piles with no rhyme or reason, so that you could have chips that are with beer, which are also with makeup, which are also with televisions, and it's all just kind of piled together. It would be near impossible to find anything of your desired item in a store that has that type of organization, or lack thereof. Versus the more organized a store, the easier it is to find the items you're looking for. And this is true for our memory as well. Now, our memories are not so much a hodgepodge or piled up or ordered systematically by barcodes or the Dewey Decimal System or something to that effect, but rather what determines the organization of memories in the brain is how interconnected they are with other information and memories that are already stored in long-term memory. Now, when we're trying to remember something, it is not like there is a file clerk or something to that effect that looks through an index and is like, ah, okay, this particular memory is stored at these coordinates or this set of neuronal activity. It doesn't actually work like this because, as you'll recall, I've mentioned several times throughout this course now, there is no central being that is us that is directing everything else. Rather, the entire brain in tandem with our body is what makes us us, and there is nothing to point out that a particular memory is at some location. Rather, the way it seems to work is we're constantly moving through our memories, and one memory being connected to another is ultimately how we move from one memory to another. And of course, this movement is metaphorical. It's just activation traveling across the network itself. And from that memory, one can move through its connections to the memories to which it is connected, and so on and so forth. And so the more ways in which a new item is connected to existing knowledge, the more routes one has to activate that memory and thus recall it. So the implication of this being that the more connections we have to any specific memory, the easier that item is to be recalled from long-term memory, as there are multiple ways to get to that memory, not just a single one. Now, conversely, if a piece of information is encoded but has no real connections to anything else in your sort of common day life, or just even to other knowledge in general, it is very unlikely to be remembered in the future. And this is oftentimes what will happen when we're trying to just remember lists of words only looking at the words themselves. They do get encoded, it's just they get encoded into just blank spaces that aren't really connected to anything else, and thus to then get our activation to that place is next to impossible because there are no routes to get there. A way of thinking about this in the real world is if you think about cities, there are oftentimes many, many different roads that you could drive on to get to that city. Thus, if one road is closed, which could be that you've forgotten some aspect of your memory, you can just reroute and drive through some other way of getting into the city. Versus if you imagine a small remote town that's up on a hill somewhere that maybe only has one or two roads to get there, if those get snowed in, there's no way to enter or leave that town. And this is further exacerbated by if you have certain chains. If I have a set of cities that are all connected with many, many sets of roads, I can easily move back and forth across all of these cities due to all this nature of connections. But now imagine there are several remote towns up this mountain, each only connected by a single road. Now, in order to get to the final town, if any of the roads are broken or snowed in or something to this effect, I can no longer move across this chain, and thus all subsequent items down the chain are unlikely to be remembered. The reason that deeper processing is related to this notion is the more deeply we sort of ponder and think about the meaning of certain items that we're trying to remember, the more connections we tend to form between this new item and some other aspect of our knowledge. So if I'm thinking, for example, to go back to this difference between looking for letter E's versus looking at rhymes versus looking at how pleasant words are, in this case, in E's, I don't really actually have to remember anything at all. I'm not really required to encode anything, and at best I'm recalling only the letter E to find it. For the rhymes, I'm thinking about the word itself, and I'm thinking about some of the semantic sounds of the word along with another word that it is now rhymed to. So there is some degree of connection forming between those concepts. Now, when I'm trying to determine how pleasant something is, not only am I looking at the word, I'm also thinking about what its semantic context is, what does it mean? And in order to then think about how pleasant it is, I think about the context in which this word and the action or event that is associated with it actually unfolds. And based on that event, then I make a determination of pleasantness. And here you can see a far greater degree of different pieces of information just got activated. And that process of activation in learning is one of the things that causes us to form connections. This is why our attention is so important when we're trying to learn new things. It helps further this increased rate of forming connections across different types of ideas. This is also why it can be very important when you're learning new topics in school to, as much as possible, try to relate them to real life. Because the more and more you relate them to real life, you have more and more ways to remember the items that you are being required to learn, because you're tying them now to existing thought structures that you already have in place. Versus if you just sit in a class, only try to absorb the material, leave the class, don't think about it again, and don't relate it to anything else, that material ultimately becomes isolated. It might be connected to itself in some ways, but is really not connected to anything else. And therefore you're unlikely to be able to easily access it. An empirical example to show this. So this is again Craig and Tulving in 1975. The paper was called Depth Processing and the Retention of Words in Episodic Memory. So this is the same paper in which they had people look at the letter E, the rhymes, pleasantness, and the actual learn this condition and looked at differences in memory performance. So in another one of the studies, they had participants determine if words fit into given sentences with some blank space, and there were 3 different sets or conditions within this, and it was all incidental learning. They were never told to actually learn the words, they were just tested on this later. If you're interested in looking at the paper, this was experiment 7. So the 3 types of conditions just varied the complexity of sentences. So for example, there could be a sentence, she cooked the blank, and the word is chicken, versus the blank frightened the children, again the word being chicken, versus the great bird swooped down and carried off the struggling blank with, again, chicken. And so in all of these cases, ultimately what they're doing is responding yes and no, whether this word fits, and then they're tested on these words later. For example, did you see the word chicken in the earlier task? The findings indicate that the more complex the sentence, right, so the great bird swooped down is more complex than the frightened the children one, and that is more complex subsequently than she cooked the chicken. The greater the complexity of the sentence, the greater the words were recalled at some later test point. And now the reason for this is the greater the complexity of the sentence, the more items you are attaching the word chicken to. When she cooked a chicken, it's just she cooked a chicken, right? You could tie it to her, maybe a picture of a woman cooking a chicken, and that's about all you have. I mean, sure, you could tie it to additional things because you have overactive imaginations, but this is more of just the general notion of it. Now, when the chicken frightened the children, it's a little bit more happening in this scene. So the chicken somehow showed up to frighten the children. There are a bunch of children now. They're frightened. That leads to reactions on the children's faces because otherwise, how do you know that they're frightened? What frightened them? It was the chicken. Again, you have a greater degree of interconnectedness between different memory items. This is further increased with this picture of a great bird swooping down and carrying off a struggling chicken. It's just the complexity is greater and it requires more various memory nodes to ultimately understand this whole sequence of events. And that greater the degree of interconnectivity will increase the likelihood of being able to remember specific items.